Chapter 62 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 62. A Savage Artist. The ensanguined skull was the first object that caught my eye. The dead man was easily identified. The body, short, plump, and rotund, could be no other than that of the unfortunate Irishman. His jacket had been stripped off, but some tattered remnants of sky blue, still clinging to his legs, aided me in identifying him. Poor fellow. The lure of Californian metal had proved an ill star for him. His golden dream was at an end. He was lying along the sward, upon his side, half doubled up. I could not see his face. His hands were over it, his palms spread out as if shading his eyes from the sun. It was a position of ordinary repose, and one might have fancied him asleep. But the gory crown and red mottling upon the shirt, seemingly still wet, forbade the supposition. He slept, but it was the sleep of death. My eyes wandered in search of the others. There were fires burning. They were out upon the plain, some 300 yards from the base of the butte. They had been lately kindled, for their smoke was rising in thick columns, part of it falling again to the earth. Around the fires and through the smoke flitted the forms of the Indians. They appeared to be cooking and feasting. Some of them, staggering over the ground, kept up an incessant babble, at intervals varying their talk with savage whoops. Others danced around, accompanying their leaps with the monotonous hee-hee-hee-yah. All appeared to have partaken freely of the fire-water of Taos. A few more seriously disposed were grouped around 4 or 5 prostrate forms, evidently the bodies of their slain. The 2 we had shot from their horses must have been amongst these, since they were no longer to be seen where they had fallen. Those around the bodies stood hand in hand, chanting the dismal death song. Not far from the fires, a group fixed my attention. It consisted of 3 figures, all in attitudes as different as it was possible to place them in. He who lay along the ground upon his back was the young hunter Wingrove. He still wore his fringed buckskin shirt and leggings, and by these I recognized him. He was at too great a distance for his features to be distinguished. He appeared to be bound hand and foot, with his ankles lashed together, and his wrists tied behind his back. He was thus lying upon his arms, in an irksome position, but the attitude showed that he was alive. I knew it already. Some 6 paces from him was a second form, difficult to be recognized as that of a human being, though it was one. It was the body of Jephthah Bigelow. Its very oddness of shape enabled me to identify it, odder from the attitude in which I now beheld it. It was lying flat along the grass, face downward, the long ape-like legs and arms stretched out to their full extent, both as to length and width, and radiating from the thin trunk, like spokes from the nave of a wheel. Viewing it from my elevated position, this attitude appeared all the more ludicrous, though it was easy to perceive that it was not voluntary. The numerous pegs standing up from the sward, and the cords attached to them and leading to the arms and limbs, showed that the spread eagle position was a constrained one. That it was sure shot, I had no doubt. The spare locks of clay-colored hair were playing about in the breeze, and some remnants of bottle green still clung around his limbs. But without these, the spider-like frame was too characteristic to be mistaken. I was glad to see those yellowish tufts. They told that the wearer still lived, as was also made manifest by the fact of his being bound. A dead body would not have merited such particular treatment. It was the third figure of this group that most strongly claimed my attention. I saw that it was not that of a warrior, though quite as tall as many upon the plain, but the contour of the form was different, as was the fashion of the garments that draped it. It was the figure of a woman. Had I not been guided in my conjectures by a certain foreknowledge, by the allusions that had occurred in the speeches of Red Hand, I should never have dreamt of identifying that form. Forewarned by these, the apparition was not unexpected. The woman was Suwannee. She was standing erect by the prostrate form of the young hunter, her head slightly bent, and her face turned towards him. An occasional motion of her arm showed that she was speaking to him. The gesture seemed to indicate a threat. Was it possible that in that dread hour she was reviling him? I was at too great a distance either to hear her words or note the expression upon her face. Only by the dumb show of her gesticulations could I tell that a scene was passing between them. A glance around the plain enabled me to note some other changes that had recently taken place. The horses of the Indians were now picketed upon the grass, and browsing peacefully, as if the clangor of strife had never sounded in their ears. I could see my own Arab a little apart with Wingrove's horse and the mules, all in the charge of a horse guard, who stood sentry near them. The wagon was still by the base of the mound. The cedars along its sides were yet unburnt. I thought that the flames had consumed them, but no. The object of their fires had been to blind us with their smoke, thus to drive us from our position and facilitate our capture. I was not permitted to make these observations without interruption. The savage who had stood by me had a duty to perform, and during all this time he was busied in its performance. A singular and inexplicable operation it had first appeared to me. His initiatory act was to blacken my body from the waist upward, including my face, throat, and arms. The substance used appeared to be a paste of charcoal, which he rubbed rudely over my skin. A circle upon my breast, that traced out by the blade of the chief, was left clear, but as soon as the black ground had been laid on, a new substance was exhibited of snow-white colour, resembling chalk or gypsum. With this, after the blood had been carefully dried off, the circular space was thickly coated over until a white disc, about as large as a dining plate, showed conspicuously on my breast. A red spot in the centre of this was necessary to complete the escutcheon, but the painter appeared at a loss for the colour, and paused to reflect. Only a moment did he remain at fault. He was an ingenious artist, and his ingenuity soon furnished him with an idea. Drawing his knife and sticking the point of it some half-inch deep into the fleshy part of my thigh, he obtained the required carmine, and after dipping his finger in the blood and giving it a dab in the centre of the white circle, he stood for a short time contemplating his work. A grim smile announced that he was satisfied with it, and uttering a final grunt, the swarthy Apelles leaped down from the platform and disappeared from my sight. A horrid suspicion had already taken possession of my soul, but I was not left long to speculate upon the purpose for which I had been thus bedaubed. The suspicion gave place to certainty. Upon the plain directly in front of me, and at less than 100 yards distance from the butte, the warriors were collecting in groups. The Red Hand with his under chiefs had already arrived there, and the other Indians were forsaking the fires and hurrying up to the spot. They had left their lances apart, standing upright on the plain, with their shields, bows, and quivers leaning against them, or suspended from their shafts. The only weapons taken along with them to the common rendezvous were the muskets. With these they were now occupying themselves, apparently preparing them for use. I saw them mark out a line upon the grass by stretching a lazo between two upright pegs. I saw them wiping, loading, and priming their pieces, in short, going through all the preliminary maneuvers observed by marksmen preparing for a trial of skill. Then burst on me in all its broad reality the dread horror for which I was reserved. Then did I comprehend the design of that white circle with its centre of red. The savages were about to hold a shooting match. My own bosom was to be their target. End of chapter 62. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 63 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 63. A Pitiless Pastime. Yes, to hold a shooting match was undoubtedly the design of my captors, and equally clear was it that my breast was to be their mark. This explained my position upon the summit of the mound, as well as my attitude upon the cross. I was bound to the latter in order that my person might be held erect, spread, and conspicuous. I could not comfort myself with any doubt as to their intention. Every movement I saw confirmed it, and the question was finally set at rest by Red Hand, possessing himself of one of the loaded muskets and making ready to fire. Stepping a pace or two in front of the line of his warriors, he raised the piece to his shoulder and pointed it towards me. It is vain to attempt describing the horror I endured at that moment. Utterly unable to move, I gazed upon the glistening barrel with its dark tube that threatened to send forth the leaden messenger of death. I have stood before the pistol of the duellist. It is not a pleasant position to be in, under any conditions of quarrel. Still, it is perfect happiness compared with that I then held. In the former case, there are certain circumstances that favor the chances of safety. You know that you are en profile to your antagonist, thus lessening the danger of being hit. Judging by yourself, you feel assured that the aim taken will be quick and unsteady, and the shot a random one. You are conscious of possessing the capability of motion, that whether you may feel inclined to give way to it or not, you still have a certain discretion of avoiding the deadly missile, that by superior skill or quickness you may anticipate your antagonist and hinder his bullet from being sent. There are other circumstances of a moral nature to sustain you in a trial of this kind: pride, angry passion, the fear of social contempt, and stronger than all, perhaps most frequent of all, the jealousy of rival love. From none of all these could I derive support as I stood before the raised musket of the Arapaho. There was no advantage, either moral or physical, in my favor. I was broad front to the danger, without the slightest capacity of dodging it, whilst there was nothing to excite the nerves of the marksman or render his aim unsteady. On the contrary, he was sighting me as coolly as if about to fire at a piece of painted plank. It may have been but a minute that the savage occupied himself in adjusting his aim, but to me it appeared 10. In such a situation I may have believed the seconds to be minutes. They seemed so. In reality, the time must have been considerable. The drops of sweat that had started from my brow were chasing each other over my cheeks and trickling down upon my breast. So prolonged was the suspense, I began to fancy that the Arapaho was designedly dallying with his aim for the purpose of sporting with my fears. He may have had such motive for procrastination. I could have believed it. Distant though he was, I could mark his fiendish smile as he repeatedly dropped the piece from his shoulder and then returned it to the level. That he meant more than mere menace, however, was proved in the end. Having satisfied himself with several idle feints, I saw him make demonstration, as if setting himself more determinedly to the work. This time he was certainly in earnest. His cheek lay steadily along the stock. His arms appeared more rigid. His finger was pressing on the trigger. The moment had come. The flash from the pan, the red stream poured forth from the muzzle, the hiss of the bullet, were all simultaneous. The report came afterwards, but before it had reached my ears, I knew that I was untouched. The lead had already whizzed past at a distance, as I could judge by the sound of several feet from my body. I heard a scratching behind me, and the instant after, a swarthy face was thrust before my eyes. It was that of the artist who had painted me for the part I was playing. I had been under the impression that he had gone down to the plain, but I now perceived my error. He had remained near me, concealing his body behind the rock. I saw that he was now enacting a different role, that of marker for the marksman. Running his eye over my body, and perceiving that I was nowhere hit, he telegraphed the intelligence to his comrades upon the plain, and then glided back to his covert. I was relieved from the terrible anxiety, but only for a short moment, a mere interval of about a dozen seconds' duration. The red hand, after firing, had resigned his place, but this was instantly occupied by one of his sub-chiefs, who, armed with another musket, in turn stepped up to the line. Again I saw the gleaming barrel brought to the level, with its dark tube pointed upon my body. This marksman was more expeditious, but for all that it was to me a time of racking torture. Again did the drops bead out upon my brow and chase one another down my cheeks. Again had I to undergo all the agony of death itself, and as before, without dying or even losing a drop of blood. As before, I beheld the puff of smoke, the flash, the blaze of fire projected from the muzzle, but ere the crack reached me, I heard the thud of the bullet as it flattened against the granite on which I stood. This time the marker did not mount up to the platform. He had seen the splinters shivered from the rock, and without further inquiry, for the second time, telegraphed a miss. A third candidate appeared upon the stand, and my fears returned, as acute as ever. This fellow caused me to suffer nearly a dozen deaths. Either was his gun without a flint, or his powder damp, since after snapping nearly a dozen times, the piece still refused to go off. Had it been designed to give me a new horror, the thing could have been better planned, for each time that the savage essayed to fire, I had to undergo the agony of a fresh apprehension. The scene ended by another gun being placed in his hands. That did go off, but with no advantage to the clumsy marksman, for his bullet, like that of the Red Hand, whistled past, far wide of the mark. A fourth now took the ground. This was a tall, swarthy warrior, one of the tallest of the tribe, and without the insignia of a chief. The cool and deliberate manner in which he went about his work caused me to anticipate in him a better shot, and my apprehensions were heightened to a degree of painful intensity. I felt my whole frame shiver as his gun blazed forth, and for a time I believed myself hit. The cheer of his companions upon the plain announced the belief in the success of the shot, but he upon the summit soon undeceived them, just as I became myself reassured. The bullet had struck the woodwork of my crucifix, one of the cross pieces to which my arms were attached. It was the shock of the timber that had deceived me into the belief that I had been struck. A fifth marksman followed, and then another and another, until more than a dozen had tried their hands. The guns were now all emptied, but this caused only a temporary cessation in the cruel sport. They were soon reloaded, and new candidates stepped forward to make trial of their skill. I had by this time discovered that they were not practicing for mere sport. It was a game, and bets were laid upon it. Apart upon the plain, the stakes were placed, consisting of saddles, robes, weapons, and the plunder of the emigrant wagon. Horses also were picketed near, surplus animals, that were betted against one another, whether in many separate wagers, or all forming a grand pool, I could not determine. My own scalp, I was uncertain whether I still wore it, was no doubt the chief object of the contest. It was the cup to be given to him who should place his bullet in that white circle upon my breast, and nearest the red spot in the centre. The guns being once more reloaded, the firing recommenced. I saw that only one shot was allowed to each, and this only to those who had entered a stake. The condition gave me an opportunity of experiencing my apprehensions in different degrees, since, according to the apparent adroitness or clumsiness of the marksman, my fears of being hit were greater or less. Strange to say, before a dozen shots had been fired, I no longer wished them to miss. The dread ordeal, so oft repeated, was too terrible to be borne. I was sustained by no hope of ultimate escape. I knew that the fiends would continue firing till some one of them should finish me by a fatal shot, and I cared not how soon it would be sent. Nay, I even desired that it should come quickly. Death was preferable to the agony I was enduring. End of chapter 63. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 64 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 64. 100 Deaths. For a full hour was the pitiless pastime continued, during which at least 50 shots had been fired at my person. The truculent chieftain had threatened me with 100 deaths. He was fulfilling his threat to the letter, for notwithstanding the unskilful practice, I felt, on the eve of each discharge, a certain creeping of the flesh and curdling of the blood, as if that moment was to be my last. If I had not yet died 100 times, for at least so many had I felt all the sensations that should precede actual death. In truth, over 100 times, for although but 50 shots had been fired, twice as often had the old guns snapped or flashed in the pan, and each of these was preceded by its special pang. I had not escaped altogether unscathed. I had been hit in 2 or 3 places, in my arms and limbs. Blood was running down my legs and creeping over my feet. I could feel it warm and wet as it trickled between my toes. In a little hollow of the rock directly in front of me, a crimson pool was collecting. The wounds could not be severe, since I scarcely felt them. Perhaps only the crease of a bullet. A scratch would be sufficient to cause the effusion of the blood, copious though it appeared to be, and I felt certain that no bone had yet been broken, that no vital part of my body had been touched. After about an hour had been spent by the savages in their fiendish sport, the firing became suddenly suspended. I could not tell why, and sought for an explanation by watching the movements of the marksmen. Had they exhausted their ammunition? This was the idea that came uppermost. The chiefs had turned face to face, and were again engaged in some earnest deliberation. The subject of their talk was made known by their gesticulations. They were pointing towards Sure Shot, who still lay, as I have described, flat upon his face. Wingrove was no longer there, nor yet Suwannee. Where could they have gone? I had seen both but the moment before. Had she unbound and rescued him? Was it about them that the savages were in consultation? No, the result proved not. It was the deserter who was the object of their attention, as was soon made manifest by their movements. Half a dozen warriors were seen separating from the group and running up to the spot where Sure Shot lay. Stooping around him, they undid his fastenings, and then, having raised him to his feet, commenced dragging him towards the crowd of marksmen. The terrified man made no resistance. It would have been idle. There was a brawny savage on each side, grasping him by the wrist, and 3 or 4 behind, pushing him forward at a run. His long hair, streaming loosely, strengthened the expression of despair that was depicted upon his countenance. No doubt he deemed it his last hour. Whither could they be dragging him? Whither but to death? This was my own belief at first, but in a few minutes I had reason to change it. For a short while Sure Shot was encircled by the dusky forms, and I saw him not, or only the crown of his head, conspicuous by its yellow hue among the darker chevelures of the Indians. What were they doing to him? I could not guess, but they appeared to be offering him no further violence. After a time the group scattered from around him, and the ex-rifleman was again uncovered to my view. With some surprise I perceived that the expression of his countenance had undergone a total change. It was no longer that of terror, much less of despair. On the contrary, there was a certain air of confidence visible in his look and manner, as if something had been said or done to him that had given him satisfaction. I was further surprised at perceiving that he had a gun in his hands, his own rifle, and that he was in the act of loading the piece. My surprise changed to indignation as I saw him step forward to the line and stand facing me, evidently with the intention to fire. Cowardly traitor! He has accepted life upon some base condition. Jeff Bigelow, Sure Shot, whom I thought true as steel. I would not have believed it. Such was the reflection to which my gag prevented me from giving utterance. In reality, I felt astonished at the behavior of the old ranger. I believed him a better man, but the dread of death is a powerful test to apply to the human soul, and hard must be the conditions of life when under such circumstances they are refused. Sure Shot had succumbed to the temptation. Such was my belief as I saw him raise his piece and stand confronting me in an attitude that too plainly bespoke his intention. Another surprise awaited me, another stimulus to my indignation. Instead of looking ashamed of his work and cowering under my glance, he appeared eager and determined to execute the dastardly design. There was even an expression of fierceness, ill becoming his countenance, habitually meek. Under other circumstances, it would have been ludicrous enough. Bravado, thought I, assumed, no doubt to give satisfaction to his new allies. I had not recovered from the confusion of my surprise when his voice fell upon my ear, uttered in a tone of anger and accompanied with corresponding gestures. But the words that reached me explained all. On hearing them, I no longer suspected the loyalty of my old comrade. The angry expression was assumed, but the counterfeit had a design far different from that which I had attributed to it. It was Sure Shot himself, still tricky as true. "Captain," cried he, speaking quickly and raising his gun with a gesture of menace, "pay attention to what I'm 'bout to say. Look savagerous at me. Make these yer vermin b'lieve you and me's quelling. Foremost tell me ef they've crippled ye 'bout the legs. I know you can't speak, but shet your eyes, and that says no." I was for the moment puzzled by the matter as well as matter of his speech, which in no way corresponded. In an instant, however, I perceived that he had some design, and I hastened to obey his hurried instructions. As to the first, I needed to make no alteration in my demeanour. Under the belief that he was disloyal, I had been regarding him with a glance sufficiently scowling. I preserved the expression, at the same time closing my eyes, as a negative answer to his query. Although I believed myself to be hit somewhere about the legs, I felt confident that I was not crippled. "So fur good," continued he, still speaking loudly and angrily. "Now, slew your right elbow down a leetle, and gie me a better chance at that there strip o' hide. I kinder guess as how I kin cut the thing. It 'pears to be all o' one piece, and'll peel off yer body like a rope o' rushes. Ef I cut it, there'll be a chance for ye. There's only one o' the varming ahint the mound. Your horse air there. Make for the animal, mount him, and put off like a streak o' greased lightnin'. Now!" As he finished speaking, he stepped nearer to the line and placed himself in an attitude to fire. I now fully comprehended his design. I saw, as he said, that the cord which bound me to the crucifix was all of one piece, a thin thong of rawhide, lapped not very tightly around my arms, legs, and body. If cut through at any point, it could easily be detached. And true enough, my horse must be behind the butte, for I could not see him in front. By a quick rush I might succeed in reaching him before the Indians could intercept me. If so, then indeed might there be a chance of escaping. End of chapter 64. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 65 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 65. A Sharp Shot. Slender as appeared the prospect of my being freed from my fastenings by the method proposed, I was not without some faith in Sure Shot being able to cut the thong. His skill in the use of the rifle was notorious, even among good marksmen, and his aim believed to be unerring. I had known him to bring down with his bullet a bird upon the wing, and had heard him declare that it was not by the eye, but by the mind, that he did it. In other words, he meant that his skill was not mechanical, but that he was guided in the act by some mental operation, which he himself but imperfectly understood. I could believe this the more readily, since Sure Shot was not the only marksman I had known possessed of this peculiar power. A something inexplicable, which may be classed with the mysterious phenomena of clairvoyance and horse whispering. With such belief in his skill, therefore, I was not without some hope that he might succeed in his design, and to give him the chance he desired, I made a violent effort and wrenched my arm downward. It was to all appearance a demonstration of my wrath at what the pseudo-renegade had been saying to me, and it seemed to be thus interpreted by most of the savages who stood around him. The words of Sure Shot, spoken in English, were of course unintelligible to them, but notwithstanding the inappropriate gestures which he had made use of, the suspicions of one were aroused. This was Red Hand himself. "What says he of the yellow scalp lock to the captive?" inquired the chief in Spanish. "Let him take heed, or he too shall become a shooting mark for the Arapaho warriors." Sure Shot's reply was characteristic. It was also in broken Spanish, which the ranger had picked up during our campaign on the Rio Grande. Translated, it ran thus: "I'm only telling him how I'm about to get square with him. Caramba, great chief! When I was a soldier in the army, yon fellow was my capitano, and gave me a flogging. Believe me, chief, I'm right glad of this opportunity to have revenge on him. That's what I've been saying to him." "Ugh!" grunted the savage, apparently satisfied with the explanation. "Neow, capting!" angrily shouted the rifleman, once more raising his piece to the level. "Looky out! Don't be skeert about my hittin' o' ye. The wang lies well ageen the bit o' timber. The ball's a big un. I reckon I kin bark it anyhow. Here's to try." A tall, yellow-haired man, standing with a rifle to his shoulder, his sallow cheek resting against the stock, the barrel apparently aligned upon my body, the quick detonation of a percussion cap, a stream of red fire and smoke from the muzzle, a shock followed by the quivering of the timbers to which I was tied, were perceptions and sensations of almost simultaneous occurrence. Twisting my head and turning my eyes almost out of their sockets, I was able to note the effect of the shot. The thong had been hit just at the point where it doubled over the edge of the wood. It was cut more than half through. By raising my elbow to its original position and using it as a lever, I could tear apart the crushed fibres. I saw this, but in the anticipation of a visit from the marker, I prudently preserved my attitude of immobility. In a moment after, the grinning savage came gliding in front of me, and perceiving the track of the bullet, pointed it out to those upon the plain. I was in a feverish state of suspense lest he might suspect design, but was relieved on seeing him step aside, while the shuffling, grating noise from behind admonished me. that he was once more letting himself down over the edge of the platform. The crowd had already closed around Sure Shot, who appeared to be expostulating with the chief, as if offering some explanation of his failure. I did not wait to witness the denouement. Raising my elbow and giving my arm a quick jerk, I heard the thongs snapping asunder and saw the broken ends spring out from their folds. Another wrench set my right arm free, and then clutching the loosened coils, I unwound them with as much rapidity as if I had been freeing myself from the embrace of a serpent. Not one of the Indians saw what I was about, till after I had undone my fastenings. Their eyes had been turned upon Sure Shot, with whom they appeared to be engaged in some angry altercation. It was only after I had sprung to one side and stood clear of the crucifix that I heard their ejaculations of astonishment, followed by a wild, continuous yelling. I stayed not to note what they were doing. I merely glanced towards them as I turned away, and perceived that they were still fixed to their places, as if petrified by surprise. The moments were precious, and bounding across the platform, I leaped down upon the opposite side. There was a little shelf about 6 feet below the summit. I found it occupied by the indigenous artist. He was seated upon the edge, with his legs hanging over. His back was towards me, and he was only apprised of what had transpired by seeing me as I sprang to his side. He had already heard the yells from the other side, and was about to get to his feet. At the moment I dropped down behind him. He was too late for the accomplishment of this purpose. I saw that he was unarmed, but was apprehensive that, by flinging himself upon me, he might hold or delay me. I hesitated not as to what I should do. Pushing forward, I planted my foot against his shoulder, and giving his body a violent impulsion, projected it clear over the edge. I saw it striking upon the angular prisms, and bounding from block to block, till it sunk out of sight amidst the tortuous branches of the cedars. I ran down the sloping path, taking many yards at a step. Not far off was my horse, with that of Wingrove and the mules. They formed a little group, but no longer under charge of a guard, for the latter had just left them, and was running forward to intercept me. I saw that he had a weapon in his hand. It was a gun. He was pointing it upon me as he ran, endeavouring to take aim before firing. I heeded not the threatening attitude, but rushed straight towards him. I could not go round him, since he was between me and the horses. We both ran as if to meet one another. When less than 5 paces separated us, the Indian stopped, sighted me, and pulled trigger. His gun snapped. Before he could lower the piece, I had clutched the barrel, and with a desperate effort wrenched the weapon from his grasp. I made a feint to strike him over the head. He threw up his arms to ward off the blow. Instead of using the gun as a club, I thrust him with the butt right under the ribs, and stretched him gasping upon the grass. He fell as if shot through the head, still holding on to the gun, which by strange accident proved to be my own rifle. I ran up to my horse. The creature welcomed me with a neigh of joy. It was but the work of a moment to draw the picket pin, gather up the lariat, and spring to his back. Once there, I felt that I was free. The Indians came screaming around the butte, most of them afoot, and with no other weapons than the empty muskets. A few more prudent than their fellows had made towards their arms and horses, but both being at a distance, they had not yet reached them, and the advantage was mine. I was no longer hurried in my actions, not even afraid. I had no apprehension of being retaken. On the back of my brave steed, I felt like an ocean castaway, who has climbed up the sides of a strong ship and once more stands safely upon deck. I felt confident that from my pursuers I could gallop away at will, and after taking time to adjust my lariat as a halter, I gave the head to my horse and rode off. My Arab needed no urging. Up the valley went he, like a bird upon the wing. I could laugh to scorn the savage pack that came hollowing behind me. End of chapter 65. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 66 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 66. I made direct for the canyon whence issued the stream. Its gap grew wider as I approached it, though still appearing only a dark cleft between the rocks, like the entrance to some subterranean passage. I looked forward to it with satisfaction. Its shadowy chasm promised shelter and concealment. When near the entrance of the gorge, I passed the ground where the wagon had been captured. Part of its load, barrels and heavy boxes, were lying upon the sward. They were all broken and rifled of their contents. The plunder had been carried to the butte. The dead bodies were still there, only those of the white men. I even halted to examine them. They were all stripped of their clothing, all scalped, and otherwise mutilated. The faces of all were blood-debauched. Under the red mask I could not have recognized them, even had they been the faces of old friends. There were 6 of them. Divested of their garments, I could form no conjecture as to who or what they had been, whether teamsters or immigrants, gold-seekers or soldiers. The Mormon could not have been among them. The bodies were all too stout for his, while on the other hand there were none of them that could have been mistaken for that of the squatter Holt. I turned away from the sickening sight and continued my gallop. My pursuers were a good mile behind me. The sun had already sunk over the crest of the cliffs, and I could just see the mounted savages through the darkling gloom, still following as fast as their horses could gallop. And 5 minutes after I had entered the gorge. The twilight continued no longer. In the canyon it was night. I followed the stream upwards, keeping along near the bank. Thick darkness was over and around me, but the gleam of the water and its rippling sound served to guide me on the path. I could not see any track, either of horses or wagons, but I knew they had passed over the ground. There was a narrow strip of bottom land, thickly timbered, and an opening through the trees indicated the road the wagons must have taken. I trusted the trail to my horse. In addition to his keen instinct, he had been trained to tracking, and with his muzzle projected forward and downward, so that his lips almost touched the earth, he lifted the scent like a hound. We could only make progress at a quick walk, but I consoled myself with the thought that my pursuers could go no faster. Seeing how easily I had ridden away from them, they might determine to abandon the pursuit, returning to revenge themselves upon my fellow captives. About these my mind was filled with bitter reflections, and strange enough, my strongest sympathies were with Sure Shot. I could not help thinking that he had sacrificed himself to save me. There could be no doubt of his having done so. He had been offered life on some traitorous condition, and could have lived. The Indian whom I had hurled over the rocks, if still alive, would explain my escape. The cunning savages would easily understand it. My brave comrade would take my place upon the crucifix? For Wingrove I had less fear. Surely love, even slighted love, would save him from the sacrifice. Yet after what had occurred, I had little reason to hope even for him. I could think of but one chance of rescuing them, to overtake the train and prevail upon the escort to return. I wondered at the dragoons having abandoned the wagon and left the poor fellows who were with it to their fate. I could only explain such conduct by supposing that these had been far behind, and that their disaster was still unknown to the people of the caravan. The 6 men who had fallen might have been the only ones along with the wagon, and their firing, as they defended themselves, might not have been heard. The roar of the water in the canyon might have drowned the reports of their guns, and, as I now listened to its deafening sound, I could believe this hypothesis. Indulging in such conjectures, I had groped my way some 2 or 3 miles up the gorge, when I became sensible of a singular faintness stealing over me. A chill crept through my frame, not like that produced by cold from without, but as if the blood was freezing in my veins. The feeling was accompanied by a sense of torpor and lassitude, like that experienced by one dropping to sleep in snowstorm. I made an effort to rouse myself, thinking it was sleep that was oppressing me. It might well have been, since it was more than 30 hours since I had slept, and then only for a short while. It occurred to me that, by dismounting and walking for a distance, I might recover warmth and wakefulness. With this design, I alighted from my horse. Once upon the ground, I discovered that I could not walk, that I could not even keep my feet. My limbs tottered under me as if I had been for months bedrid. Only by holding on to my horse could I stand erect. What could it mean? My Arab turned his face towards me as if making the same inquiry. I endeavored to remount him, but could not. I was unable even to clamber upon his back, and after an unsuccessful effort, desisted, still supporting myself against his body. Had he moved away at that moment, I should have fallen. And I must have fallen, after my senses left me. In the last gleam of consciousness, I remembered standing by the side of my horse. But I must have fallen, for when thought returned, I found myself upon my back, stretched at full length along the grass. End of chapter 66. Recording by Lowe. Chapter 67 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 67. I must have fallen upon my back, or else turned upon it after falling. On opening my eyes, the sky was the first object that my glance encountered. I saw only a strip of it, of dark blue color, bordered on each side by black. I knew it was the sky by its twinkling stars, and that the black borderings were the cliffs of the canyon. By this I remembered where I was, and the stars and darkness admonished me it was still night. There was hot air upon my face, as if someone was behind breathing down upon me. I turned my head and looked upward. A pair of brilliant eyes were glancing into mine. So confused were my senses that it was some time before I made them out to be the eyes of my Arab. He was standing over me, with his muzzle close to my forehead. It was his breath I had felt upon my face. I could not tell how long I had been entranced. I had no clue to the time of night, and I was not in the position to consult the stars. I must have lain several hours, partly in syncope and partly asleep. It was fortunate I had a buffalo robe around my body. I had found it lying upon the plain among the dead men, and had snatched it up and tied it around my shoulders as I rode on. But for it, I might have perished in my slumber, since the night was chill and I had neither covering on my back nor blood in my veins to resist the cold. It was the absence of the latter that had brought me to the ground. I had left most of my blood upon the butte. Sleep or time had revived me. I was able to get to my feet, and I arose. I was still weak and staggered like a lamb, but my senses were sufficiently clear, and I now recollected everything that had transpired. I was also conscious of the danger of remaining in that place, and it was this thought that induced me to get up, with the intention of going forward. I was strong enough to mount, and just strong enough to keep the seat upon my horse, but I was aware of the necessity of putting a wider distance between myself and the Red Hand before daylight should arrive, and I continued onward up the ravine. The trace was easily followed, more easily than when I first entered the canyon. There was more light, and this must have been caused by a moon. I could see none, the cliffs hindered me, but the strip of sky visible above the rocks showed the sheen of moonlight. I rode but slowly. Feeble though I was, I could have ridden faster, but I was proceeding with caution. Strange as it may seem, I was now paying more regard to the front than the rear. I had a suspicion that my pursuers might be ahead of me. I could hardly believe in their having abandoned the pursuit after so slight an effort. Too many of them had fallen by my hand. They would scarce let me escape so easily, and with my scalp untaken, I had ascertained that the trophy was still upon my head. It was quite possible they had passed me. While endeavoring to mount my horse, I had drawn him from the path, and the place where I had found myself lying was behind some bushes, where I should have been screened from the eyes of any one riding along the track. In daylight I might have been seen, but not then. At that hour the darkness would have concealed me, and it had concealed me, as I soon discovered. My suspicion that the pursuers had passed me proved the means of saving me. But for the caution it had prompted me to observe, I should have ridden head to head against their horses. I had proceeded about a mile further, and was still advancing when my steed raised his head horizontally and gave utterance to a low snort. At the same instant he stopped without any tightening of the rein. Above the sough of the stream I heard noises. The intonation of the red man's voice was easily recognized. There were Indians in front of me. Were they coming or going? The voices grew louder as I listened. The speakers were nearing me. My first thought was to glide behind the trees, but a glance showed me that these were not tall enough. They were mere bushes. They might have concealed the body of a man, but a horse standing up could not have been hidden behind them. For a moment I was undecided as to how I should act, till I bethought me of turning and riding back to where I had lain. I was in the act of facing about, when through the sombre light I observed a break in the cliff. It appeared to be a gap, the entrance of a lateral ravine. It offered a chance of concealment, since it was even darker than within the canyon itself. I hesitated not about accepting the shelter it promised, and, heading my horse into it, I rode rapidly but silently forward. When fairly concealed under its shadowy gloom, I again halted and listened. I heard the hoof-strokes of horses and the voices of men. I recognized the deep guttural of the Arapahoes. A troop was riding past, going back towards the valley. They were those who had pursued me. Were these all of my pursuers? There appeared to be only a small party, 10 or a dozen horsemen. Others might have gone up the river, who had not yet returned. It was this doubt that caused me to hesitate. Otherwise, I should have ridden back into the canyon and kept on up the stream. But by doing so, I might place myself between two parties of my pursuers, with no chance of retreating in either direction. Moreover, pickets might have been stationed along the path. To fall upon one of these would be fatal. Why not follow the lateral ravine? I might ride up that for a distance, and then leaving it, cross over to the caravan trace, above any point to which the pursuit might have been carried. This plan appeared feasible, and, without delay, I adopted it. I rode on up the gorge, which very much resembled that I had left, only that there was no water in it. It had not always been so, for my path here and there ran over a channel of rocks, which indicated the bed of a stream, now dry. I followed the ravine for a mile or more, and then looked for a path that would take me across to the caravan trail. I looked in vain. Stupendous cliffs rose on each side. I could not scale them. I had no choice but to keep on up the ravine, but that would be going to right angles to my proper course. There was no alternative but to halt and wait for daylight. Indeed, I was too faint to ride further. Slight exertion fatigued me, and no longer in dread of immediate danger, I deemed it more prudent to stop, and, if possible, gain strength by rest. I dismounted, gave my horse to the grass, and, having wrapped myself in the warm robe, soon entered upon the enjoyment of sleep, sweeter and more natural than the involuntary slumber in which I had been lately indulging. End of chapter 67. Recording by Lo. Chapter 68 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid, Chapter 68. The blue dawn of morning was glinting among the rocks when I awoke. On the crest of the cliff was a streak of amber-colored light that betokened the rising of the sun and warned me that it was time to be stirring. I had no toilet to make, no breakfast to eat, nothing to do but mount my horse and move onward. I continued up the lateral ravine, since there was no path leading out from it, and to return to the Huerfano would have been to ride back into the teeth of danger. I still felt faint. Though less than 24 hours since I had eaten, I hungered acutely. Was there nothing I could eat? I looked inquiringly around. It was a scene of sterility and starvation, not a symptom of life, scarcely a sign of vegetation. Rocks, bare and forbidding, formed two parallel facades, grinning at each other across the gorge, their rugged features but little relieved by the mottling of dark junipers that clung from their clefts. There appeared neither root nor fruit that might be eaten. Only a chameleon could maintain existence in such a spot. I had scarcely made this reflection when, as if to contradict it, the form of a noble animal became outlined before my eyes. Its color, size, and proportions were those of a stag of the red deer species, but its spiral horns proclaimed it of a different genus. These enabled me to identify it as the rare mountain ram, the magnificent Amon of the northern Andes. It was standing upon the salient point of the cliff, its form boldly projected against the purple sky, in an attitude fixed and statuesque. One might have fancied it placed there for embellishment, a characteristic feature of that wild landscape. The scene would have been incomplete without it. From my point of observation it was 500 yards distant. It would have been equally safe at 5, since I had no means of destroying it. I might have easily crept within shot range, since a grove of cottonwoods, just commencing where I had halted, extended up the bottom of the ravine. Under these I could have stalked to the base of the cliff on which the animal stood, a sort of angular promontory projecting into the gorge. This advantage only rendered the sight more tantalizing. My gun was empty, and I had no means of reloading it. Was it certain the piece was empty? Why should the Indians have believed it to be loaded? Up to this moment I had not thought of examining it. I drew the ramrod and inverted it into the barrel. The head struck upon a soft substance. The screw stood 4 fingers above the muzzle. The gun was charged. There was no cap upon the nipple. There had been none. This accounted for the piece having missed fire. In all likelihood I owed my life to the circumstances of the savage being ignorant of the percussion principle. I was now indebted to another circumstance for a supply of cats. The locker near the heel of the stock had escaped the attention of the Indians. Its brass cover had passed for a thing of ornament. On springing it open, the little caps of the corrugated copper gleamed before my eyes, an abundance of them. I tapped the powder into the nipple, adjusted a cap, and, dismounting, set forth upon the stalk. The spreading tops of the cottonwoods concealed me, and, crouching under them, I made my approaches as rapidly as the nature of the ground would permit. It grew damper as I advanced, and, presently, I passed pools of water and patches of smooth mud where water had recently lain. It was the bed of an intermittent stream, a hydrographic phenomenon of frequent occurrence in the central regions of North America. The presence of water accounted for that of the cottonwood trees, a sure indication of moisture in the soil. The water was a welcome sight. I was suffering from thirst even more than from hunger, and, notwithstanding the risk of losing my chance of a shot, I determined to stop and drink. I was creeping forward to the edge of one of the ponds, when a sight came under my eyes that astonished me, and to such a degree as to drive both thirst and hunger out of my thoughts, at least for the moment. In the margin of sandy mud extending along the edge of the water appeared a line of tracks, the tracks of human feet. On crawling nearer, I perceived that they were moccasin tracks, but of such tiny dimensions as to leave no doubt as to the sex of the individual who had made them. Clearly, they were the imprints of a woman's feet. A woman must have passed that way. An Indian woman, of course. This was my first reflection, and almost simultaneous with it arose another half-interrogative conjecture. Was it Suwannee? No, the foot was too small for that of the forest maiden. I had a remembrance of the dimensions of hers. The tracks before my eyes were not over 8 inches in length, and could only have been made by a foot slender and of elegant shape. The imprint was perfect, and its clear outline denoted the light elastic tread of youth. It was a young woman who had made those footmarks. At first I saw no reason to doubt that the tracks were those of some Indian girl. Their size would not have contradicted the supposition. Among the aboriginal belles of America, a little foot is the rule, a large one the exception. I had tracked many a pair much smaller than those, but never had I seen the footprints of an Indian with the toes turned out, and such was the peculiarity of those now before me. This observation, which I did not make till after some time had elapsed, filled me with astonishment and something more. It was suggestive of many and varied emotions. The girl or woman who had made these tracks could never have been strapped to an Indian cradle. She must be white. End of chapter 68. Recording by Lowe. Chapter 69 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 69. It was not by any conjecture that I arrived at this conclusion. I was quite confident that the footsteps were not those of a squaw. All inexplicable as was the contrary hypothesis, I observed that they were very recent, of less than an hour's age. As I rose from regarding them, a new sign appeared on the same bed of sand, the footmarks of a wolf. No, I was deceived by resemblance. On nearer examination, they were not wolf tracks I saw, but those of a dog, and evidently a large one. These were also fresh like the woman's tracks, made doubtless at the same time. The dog had accompanied the woman, or rather had been following her, since a little further on, where both were in the same line, his tracks were uppermost. There were two special reasons why this sign should astonish me. A white woman in such a place, and wearing moccasins. But for the style of the chaussure, I might have fancied that the tracks were those of someone who had strayed from the caravan. I might not have connected them with her, ever uppermost in my thoughts. But no. Small though they were yet too large for those minion feet, well remembered. After all, I might be mistaken. Some dusky maiden might have passed that way, followed by her dog? This hypothesis would have removed all mystery, had I yielded to it. I could not. It was contrary to my tracking experience. Even the dog was not Indian. The prints of his paws proclaimed him of a different race. My perplexity did not hinder me from quenching my thirst. The pain was paramount, and after assuaging it, I turned my eyes once more towards the cliff. The wild ram had not stirred from his place. The noble animal was still standing upon the summit of the rock. He had not even changed his attitude. In all likelihood, he was acting as the sentinel of a flock that was browsing behind him. The sun was falling fair upon his body, and deepened the fern red color upon his flanks. I could note his full round eyes glistening under the golden beam. I was near enough to bring him down, and, should the rifle prove to have been properly loaded, I was likely to have for my breakfast the choicest viand of the mountain region of America. I had raised my piece, sighted the noble game, and was about to pull the trigger when, to my astonishment, the animal sprang off the cliff and, turning back downward, fell heavily into the gorge. When I saw him pitching outward from the rock, I fancied he was making one of those singular somersaults frequently practised by the Ovis Amon in descending the ledges of a cliff. Had the descent been a voluntary one, he would have come down upon his huge elastic horns instead of falling as he had done, with the dull sodden sound of a lifeless body. I perceived that the big horn had ceased to live, and the report of a gun that rang through the gorge and was still reverberating from the cliffs told the cause of his death. Some hunter, stalking on the other side, had taken the start of me. White or red, which fired the shot? If an Indian, my head would be in as much danger of losing its skin as the sheep. If a white man, I might still hope for a breakfast of broiled mutton. Even a troll might be expected to share with a starving man, but it was not the quarter in which to encounter a Christian of that kidney. It was the crack of a rifle. The red man rarely hunts with the rifle. The arrow is his favorite weapon for game. Notwithstanding the remoteness from civilization, the probabilities were that the hunter was white. He might be one of those attached to the caravan, or, more likely, a free trapper. I knew that upon several head tributaries of the Arkansas there were settlements of these singular men. From prudential considerations I kept my place. Screened by the cottonwoods, I should have an opportunity of deciding the point without my presence being suspected. If the hunter should prove to be an Indian, I could still retreat to my horse without being observed. I had not long to wait. I heard a noise as of someone making way through the bushes. The moment after, a huge wolf-like animal rushed round the projecting angle of the cliff and sprang upon the carcass of the bighorn. At the same instant a voice reached my ears. "Off there, wolf! Off, villain dog! Don't you see that the creature is killed? No thanks to you, Sierra." Good heavens! It was the voice of a woman. While I was yet quivering under the surprise produced by the silvery tones, the speaker appeared before my eyes. A girl majestically beautiful. A face smooth-skinned, with a tinge of golden brown, cheeks of purplish red, a nose slightly aquiline, with nostrils of spiral curve, eyes like those of an Egyptian antelope, a forehead white and high, above bounded by a band of shining black hair, and surmounted by the coronet of scarlet plumes. Such was the head that I saw rising above the green frondage of the cottonwoods. The body was yet hidden behind the leaves, but the girl just then stepped from out the bushes, and her whole form was exhibited to my view, equally striking and picturesque. I need not say that it was of perfect shape, bust, body, and limbs all symmetrical. A face like that described could not belong to an ungainly form. When nature designs beauty, it is rare that she does her work by halves. Unlike the artist of the anatomical school, she makes the model for herself, hence the perfect correspondence of its parts. And perhaps fairer form had nature never conceived. The dullest sculptor might have been inspired by its contemplation. The costume of the girl corresponded to the cast of her features. About both there was that air of wild picturesqueness which we observe in art paintings of the gypsy, and sometimes in the gypsy herself. For those sirens of the green lanes have not all disappeared, and, but that saw the snowy cone of Pike's Peak rising over the crest of the cliff, I might have fancied myself in the Syria Australis with a beautiful gitana standing before me. The soft fawn-skin tilma, with its gaudy broidering of beads and stained quills, the fringed skirt and buskined ankles, the striped Navajo blanket slung scarf-like over her shoulders, all presented a true gypsy appearance. The plumed circlet upon the head was more typical of transatlantic costume, and the rifle carried by a female hand was still another idiosyncrasy of America. It was from that rifle the report had proceeded, as also the bullet that had laid low the bighorn. It was not a hunter then who had killed the game, but she who stood before me, a huntress, the wild huntress. End of chapter 69. Recording by Lowe. Chapter 70 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Mayne Reid. Chapter 70. No longer was it from fear that I held back, but a hesitancy springing from surprise mingled with admiration. The sight of so much beauty, grand as unexpected, was enough to unnerve me, especially in such a place, and one to whose eye the female form had so long been a stranger. Suwani's I had seen only at a distance, and hers, to my sight, was no longer beautiful. I hesitated to show myself, lest the sight of me should alarm this lovely apparition, and cause her to take flight. The thought was not unnatural, since the tricolored pigments of black, red, and white were still upon my skin, and I must have presented the picture of a chimney sweep, with the dining plate glued upon his breast. In such a guise I knew that I must cut a ludicrous figure, and would have slipped back into the pool and washed myself, but I dreaded to take my eyes from that beautiful vision, lest I might never look upon it again. In my absence she would be gone. I feared even then that on seeing me she might take flight, and I was too faint to follow her. For this reason I stood slightly gazing through my leafy covert, like one who watches the movements of some shy and beautiful bird. I almost dreaded to breathe, lest the sound might alarm her. I was planning at the same time how I should initiate an interview. Her voice again reached me as she recommended scolding the dog. Even its chiding tones were sweet. She had approached and stooped for a moment over the bighorn, as if to satisfy herself that the animal was dead. Her canine companion did not appear to be quite sure of the fact, for he continued to spring repeatedly upon the carcass with open mouth, as if eager to devour it. "Off! Off!" cried she, threatening the dog with the butt of her rifle. "You wicked wolf! What has got into you? Have I not told you that the thing is dead? What more do you want? Mind, Sirrah," continued she, shaking her finger significantly at the dog. "Mind, my good fellow. You had no part in the killing of it, and if you spoil the skin, you shall have no share in the flesh. You hear me? Not a morsel." Wolf appeared to understand the hint, and retired. Impelled by hunger, I accepted the cue. "You will not refuse a morsel to one who is starving." "Aha! Who speaks?" cried the huntress, turning round with a glance, rather of inquiry than alarm. "Down, wolf!" commanded she, as the dog bounded forward with a growl. "Down, you savage brute! Don't you hear that someone is starving? Ha! A negro! Poor devil! Where can he have come from, I wonder?" Only my head was visible, a thick bush in front of me concealing my body. The coat of char upon my face was deceiving her. "No, not a Negro," said I, stepping out and discovering my person. "Not a Negro, though I have been submitted to the treatment of one." "Oh, white, red, and black! Mercy me! What a frightful harlequin! Ha, ha, ha! My toilet appears to amuse you, fair Huntress. I might apologize for it, since I can assure you that it is not my own conception, nor is it to my taste any more than—" "You're a white man, then?" she said, interrupting me, at the same time stepping nearer to examine me. "I was yesterday," I replied, turning half round to give her a sight of my shoulders which the Indian artist had left untouched. "Today I am as you see." "Oh, heavens!" she exclaimed, suddenly changing her manner. "This red, is it blood? You are wounded, sir. Where is your wound?" "In several places I am wounded, but not dangerously. They are only scratches. I have no fear of them." "Who gave you these wounds?" "Indians. I have just escaped from them." "Indians? What Indians?" "Arapahoes." "Arapahoes? Where did you encounter them?" The question was put in a hurried manner, and in a tone that betrayed excitement. "On the Huerfano," I replied. "By the Orphan Butte. It was the band of a chief known as the Red Hand." "Ha! The Red Hand on Huerfano! Stranger, are you sure of this?" The earnest voice in which the interrogatory was again put somewhat surprised me. I answered by giving a brief and rapid detail of our capture and subsequent treatment, without mentioning the names of my travelling companions or stating the object of our expedition. Indeed, I was not allowed to enter into particulars. I was hurried on by interpellations from my listener, who, before I could finish the narrative of my escape, again interrupted me, exclaiming in an excited manner, "Red Hand in the valley of the Huerfano? News for Wakaru?" After a pause she hastily inquired, "How many warriors has the Red Hand with him?" "Nearly 200. "Not more than 200? "No, rather less, I should say." "It is well. You say you have a horse?" "My horse is at hand." "Bring him up, then, and come along with me." "But my comrades? I must follow the train, that I may be able to return and rescue them." "You need not for such a purpose. There is one not far off who can aid you in that, better than the escort you speak of. If too late to save their lives, he may avenge their deaths for you. You say the caravan passed yesterday?" "Yesterday, about noon." "You could not overtake it and return in time. The Red Hand would be gone. Besides, you cannot get from this place to the trail taken by the caravan without going back by the canyon, and there you might meet those from whom you have escaped. You cannot cross that way. The ridge is impassable." As she said this, she pointed to the left, the direction which I had intended to take. I could see through a break in the bluff a precipitous mountain spur running north and south, parallel with the ravine I had been threading. It certainly appeared impassable, trending along the sky like the escarpment of some gigantic fortress. If this was true, there would be but little chance of my overtaking the escort in time. I had no longer a hope of being able to effect the rescue of my comrades. The delay, no doubt, would be fatal. In all likelihood, both Wingrove and Sure Shot had ere this been sacrificed to the vengeance of the Arapahoes freshly excited by my escape. Only from a sense of duty did I purpose returning, rather with the idea of being able to avenge their deaths. What meant this mysterious maiden? Who possessed the power to rescue my comrades from 200 savages, the most warlike upon the plains? Who was he that could aid me in avenging them? "Follow me, and you shall see," replied the Huntress, in answering to my interrogatory. "Your horse! Your horse! Hasten, or we shall be too late. The Red Hand in the valley of the Huerfano. Wakaru will rejoice at the news. Your horse! Your horse!" I hastened back for my Arab, and hurriedly led him to the spot. "A beautiful creature!" exclaimed she, on seeing the horse. "No wonder you were able to ride off from your captors. Mount!" "And you?" "I shall go afoot. But stay, time is precious. Can your steed carry us both?" "Undoubtedly he can." "Then it is better we should both ride. Half an hour is everything, and if the Red Hand should escape, you mount first. Be quick." It was not the time to be squeamish, even under the glance of the loveliest eyes. Taking the robe from my shoulders, I spread it over the back of my horse, and employing a piece of the lariat as a surcingle, I bound it fast. Into the improvised saddle I mounted, the girl from a rock leaping upon the croup behind me. "You, Wolf!" cried she, apostrophizing the dog. "You stay here by the game and guard it from the coyotes. Remember, rascal, not a mouthful till I return. Now, stranger," she continued, shifting closer to me and clasping me around the waist, "I am ready. Give your steed to the road, and spare him not, as you value the lives of your comrades. Up the ravine lies our way. Ho! Onward!" The brave horse needed no spur. He seemed to understand that the speed was required of him, and stretching at once into a gallop, carried us gaily up the gorge. End of chapter 70. Recording by Lowe.
Chapter 71 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 72. A Queer Conversation. In other days, and under other circumstances, the touch of that round arm, softly encircling my waist, might have caused the current of my veins to flow fast and fevered. Not so then. My blood was thin and chill. My soul recoiled from momentary emotions, or indulged in them only as a remembrance. Even in that hour of trial and temptation, my heart was true to thee, Lilian. Had it been thy arm thus wound around my waist, had those eyes that glanced over my shoulder been blue, and the tresses that swept it gold, I might, for the moment, have forgotten the peril of my companions, and indulged only in the ecstasy of a selfish love. But not with her, that strange being with whom chance had brought me into such close companionship. For her, I had no love yearnings. Even under the entwining of that beautiful arm, my sense was cold, as if it had been in the embrace of a statue. My thoughts were not there. My captive comrades were uppermost in my mind. Her promise had given me hope that they might yet be rescued. How? And by whom? Whither were we going? And whose was the powerful hand from which help was to come? I would have asked, but our rapid movement precluded all chance of conversation. I could only form conjectures. These pointed to white men, to some rendezvous of trappers that might be near. I knew there were such. How else, in such a place, could her presence be accounted for? Even that would scarce explain an apparition so peculiar as that of this huntress maiden. Other circumstances contradicted the idea that white men were to be my allies. There could be no band of trappers strong enough to attack the dark host of Red Hand, at least with the chance of destroying it. She knew the strength of the Arapahoes. I had told her their numbers, as I had myself estimated at nearly 200 warriors. It was rare that a party of white hunters mustered above a dozen men. Moreover, she had mentioned a name, twice mentioned it, Wakaru. No white was likely to bear such an appellation. The word was undoubtedly Indian, especially as the huntress had pronounced it. I waited for an opportunity to interrogate her. It offered at length, where the path ran circuitously among loose rocks, and it was impossible to proceed at a rapid pace. I was about to initiate a dialogue, when I was forestalled in my intention. "You are an officer in the army," said my companion half interrogatively. "How should you have known that?" answered I in some surprise, perceiving that her speech was rather an assertion than a question. "Oh, easily enough. Your uniform tells me." "My uniform?" "Yes. Have you not still a portion of it left?" inquired she with a striking simplicity. "I see a mark here where lace stripes have been. That denotes an officer, does it not? The Arapahoes have stripped them off, I suppose." "There was lace, true. You have guessed correctly. I have been in the army." "And what was bringing you out here? On your way to the gold countries, I dare say." "No, indeed, not that." "What then, may I ask?" "Only a foolish freak. It was a mere tour without much purpose. I intended soon to return to the States." "Ah, you intend returning? But you say you were following the caravan, you and your 3 fellow travelers. Why were you not with it? Would it not have been safer?" I hesitated to make reply. My interrogator continued. It is not usual for so small a party to pass over the prairies alone. There is always danger from the Indians, sometimes from whites too. Ah me, there are white savages, worse savages than red, far worse, far worse. These strange speeches, with the sigh that accompanied them, caused me to turn my head and steal a glance at the countenance of my companion. It was tinged with melancholy, or rather deeply impressed with it. She, too, suffering from the past? In this glance, I again remarked what had already attracted my notice, a resemblance to Lillian Holt. It was of the slightest and so vague that I could not tell in what it lay. Certainly not in the features, which were signally unlike those of Lillian, and equally dissimilar was the complexion. Were I to place the resemblance, I should say that I saw it in the cast of the eye, and heard it in the voice. The similitude of tone was striking. Like Lillian's, it was a voice of that rich clarion sound with which beautiful women are gifted, those having the full round throat so proudly possessed by the damsels of Andalusia. Of course, reflected I, the likeness must be accidental. There was no possibility of it being otherwise, and I had not a thought that it was so. I was simply reminded of looks and tones that needed not that to recall them. The souvenir so excited hindered me from making an immediate reply. "Your observations are somewhat singular," I remarked at length. "Surely you have not verified them by your own experience?" "I have, yes, and too sadly, never to think them otherwise than just. I have had little reason to love those of my own color. That is, if I am to consider myself a white. But you are so, are you not?" "Not altogether. I have Indian blood in my veins." "Not much, I should fancy." "Enough to give me Indian inclinings, and, I fear, also a dislike to those of my own complexion." "Indeed." "Perhaps less from instinct and experience." "Ah, stranger, I have reason. Is it not enough that all have proved false? Father, lover, husband." "Husband? You are married, then?" "No." "You have been?" "No." "Why did you say husband?" "A husband only in name. I have been married, but never a wife. Wedded, but never." The speaker paused. I could feel her arm quivering around my waist. She was under the influence of some terrible emotion. "Yours must be a strange story," I remarked, with the view of inducing her to reveal it. "You have greatly excited my curiosity, but I know that I have no claim to your confidence." "You may yet win it." "Tell me how." "You say you intend returning to the States. I may have a commission for you, and you shall then hear my story. It is not much, only a simple maiden, whose lover has been faithless, her father untrue to his paternal trust, her husband a cheat, a perjured villain. Your relationships have been singularly unfortunate, but your words only mystify me more. I should give much to know who you are, and what strange chance has led you hither." "Not now. Time presses. Your comrades, if still alive, are in peril. That is your affair. But mine is that the Red Hand may not escape. If he does, there will be one who will grieve at it. One to whom I owe life and protection." "Of whom do you speak?" "Of the mortal enemy of Red Hand and his Arapahoes. Of Wakaru." "Wakaru?" "Head chief of the Utahs. You shall see him presently. Put your horse to this speed. We are close to the camp. Yonder are the smokes rising above the cliff. On, stranger, on!" As directed, I once more urged my Arab into a gallop. It was not for long. After the horse had had about 100 stretches, the canyon suddenly opened into a small but beautiful valley, treeless and turfed with grass. The white cones, appearing in serried rows near its upper end, were easily identified as an encampment of Indians. "Behold," exclaimed my companion, "the tents of the Utahs." End of chapter 71. Chapter 72 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 72. Wakaru. The lodges were aligned in double row, with a wide avenue between them. At its head stood one of superior dimensions, the wigwam of the chief. They were all of conical shape, a circle of poles converging at their tops, and covered with skins of the buffalo, grained and bleached to the whiteness of wash leather. A slit in the front of each tent formed the entrance, closed by a list of the hide that hung loosely over it. Near the top of each appeared a triangular piece of skin, projecting outward from the slope of the side, and braced so as to resemble an inverted sail of the kind known as lateen. It was a wind guard to aid the smoke in its ascent. On the outer surface of each tent was exhibited the biography of its owner, expressed in picture writing. More especially were his deeds of prowess thus recorded: encounters with the cougar and grizzly bear, with Crows, Cheyennes, Pawnees, and Arapahoes, each under its suitable symbol. The great marquis of the chief was particularly distinguished with this kind of emblematical emblazonment, being literally covered with signs and figures, like the patterns upon a carpet. No doubt, one skilled in the interpretation of these transatlantic hieroglyphs might have read from that copious cipher many a tale of terrible interest. In front of these tents stood tall spears, with shields of parfleche leaning against them. Also long bows of bois d'arc, maclura aurantica, and shorter ones of horn, the horns of the mountain ram. Skin quivers filled with arrows hung suspended from the shafts, and I observed that in almost every grouping of these weapons there was a gun, a rifle. This did not much astonish me. I knew that to the Utah the medicine weapon is no longer a mystery. Here and there, hides freshly flayed were pegged out upon the grass, with squaws kneeling around them, engaged in the operation of graining. Girls, with watertight baskets poised upon the crown of their head, were coming from or going towards the stream. Men stood in groups, idly chatting, or squatted upon the turf, playing at games of chance. Boys were busy at their bow practice, and still younger children rolled their naked bodies over the grass, hugging half-grown puppies, the companions of their infant play. Troops of dogs trotted among the tents, while a mixed herd of horses, mules, sheep, goats, and asses browsed the plains at a little distance from the camp. Such was the coup d'oeil that presented itself to my gaze as we rode up to the Utah encampment. As might be expected, our arrival caused a change in the occupation of everybody. The dicers leaped to their feet, the squaws discontinued their work, and flung their scrapers upon the skins. "Tia!" was the exclamation of astonishment that burst from hundreds of lips. Children screamed, and ran hiding behind their dusky mothers. Dogs growled and barked, horses neighed, mules hinned, asses brayed, while the sheep and goats joined their bleating to the universal chorus. "On, to the chief's tent!" counselled my companion, gliding to the ground and preceding me on foot. "Yonder, the chief himself, Wakaru." An Indian of medium size and perfect form, habited in a tunic of embroidered buckskin, leggings of scarlet cloth, headdress of coloured plumes, with crests that swept backwards and drooped down to his heels. A gaily striped serape, suspended scarf-like over the left shoulder, with a sash of red china crepe wound loosely around the waist, completed a costume more picturesque than savage. A face of noble type, with an eye strongly glancing, like that of an eagle. An expression of features in no way fierce, but, like the dress, more gentle than savage. A countenance in repose mild, almost to meekness. Such saw I. Had I known the man who stood before me, I might have remarked how little his latter expression corresponded with his real character. Not that he was cruel, but only famed for warlike prowess. I was face to face with the most noted war chief of America, whose name, though new to me, was at that moment dreaded from Oregon to Arispa, from the banks of Rio Bravo to the Sierras of Alta California. It was Walker, the war chief of the Utahs, the friend of the celebrated trapper whose name he had adopted, and which, by the modification of Utah orthoepy, had become Wakaru. An odd individual, a very odd one, was standing beside the chief as I rode up. He appeared to be a Mexican, to judge by his costume and the color of his skin. The former consisted of jaqueta and calzones of dark-colored velveteen, surmounted by a broad-brimmed sombrero of black glaze, while the complexion, although swarthy, was several shades lighter than that of the Indian. He was a man of diminutive stature, and with a countenance of a serio-comical cast. An expression of this kind pervaded his whole person, features and figure included, and was heightened by the presence of a singular accoutrement that hung suspended from his leathern waist belt. It was a piece of timber some 18 inches in length, and looking like the section of a boot tree, or the half of a wooden milk yoke. At the thick end was a concavity or socket with straps, by which it was attached to the belt, and this singular apparatus, hanging down over his thigh, added to the grotesque appearance of its owner. The little Mexican had all the cut of a character, and he was one, as I afterwards ascertained. He was no other than the famous Pedro Archulete, or Pegleg, as his comrades called him, a trapper of Taos, and one of the most expert and fearless of that fearless fraternity. The odd accoutrement which had puzzled me was nothing more than an artificial leg. It was an implement, however, he only used upon occasions, whenever the natural one, the ankle of which had been damaged by some accident, gave out through the fatigue of a march. At other times he carried the wooden leg, as I first saw it, suspended from his belt. His presence in the Indian encampment was easily accounted for. He was in alliance with their chief, for the Utahs were at that time in paz with the settlements of the Taos Valley, and the Spanish trappers and traders went freely among them. Pegleg had been on a trapping expedition to the parks, and having fallen in with the Utahs, had become the guest of Wakaru. End of Chapter 72.
Chapter 73 of The Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 73. Pegleg. "The Huntress has returned soon?" said the chief, interrogatively, as the girl glided up to him. "She brings strange game," added he, with a smile. "Who is this young warrior with the white circle upon his breast?" "He is a paleface. It is not the custom of our white brothers to adorn themselves in such fashion." "The painting is not his," replied the girl. "It has been done by the hands of his enemies, by red men. The white circle was designed for a mark, at which many bullets have been fired. The red streaks you see are blood, that has streamed from wounds inflicted on the stranger's body. When Wakaru shall know who caused that blood to flow, he will hasten to avenge it. If it be the wish of the white huntress, Wakaru will avenge the blood, even though his own people may have spilled it. Speak, Marani, you say that red men have done this. Were they Utahs?" "No, but the enemies of the Utahs. The Utahs have many enemies. On the north, south, east, and west they have foes. Whence comes the stranger, and who has been spilling his blood?" "From the east, from the Arapahoes." "Ugh!" exclaimed the chief, with a start, his countenance suddenly becoming clouded with an angry expression. "Arapahoes! Where has the paleface encountered the Arapahoes?" "On the Huerfano." "Good. The white huntress brings news that will gladden the hearts of the Utah warriors." "Arapahoes on the Huerfano. Who has seen them there?" The huntress replied by pointing to me. "He has been their captive," she added, "and has just escaped from them. He can guide Wakaru to their camp, where the Utah chief will find his deadliest enemy, Red Hand." At the mention of this name, the cloud that was gathering upon the brow of the Utah chief became darker by several shades, and the mild expression was no longer observable. In its place was a look of fierce resolve, blended with glances that spoke a savage joy. Some old and terrible resentment was rekindled by the name, with a hope, no doubt, of its being gratified. The chief now entered upon a series of interrogatories directed to myself. He spoke English, thanks to his trapper associations, and it was in this language he had been conversing with the huntress. His inquiries were directed to such particulars as might put him in possession of the necessary knowledge for an attack upon the Arapahoes. As concisely as possible, I made known their position and numbers, with other circumstances calculated to aid in the design. The account I gave seemed to gratify him. As soon as our dialogue was ended, I had the satisfaction to hear him declare his intention of proceeding at once to the valley of the Huerfano. To me it was joyful news. My comrades might yet be rescued from the hands of the Arapahoes. "Marani," said he, again addressing himself to the Huntress, "conduct the stranger to your tent. Give him food. And you, Cojo," he continued, turning to the little Mexican, "you are skilled in medicine. Look to his wounds. He can repose while we are preparing. Ho! Sound the signal of assembly. Summon our braves to the war dance." The last words were addressed to an Indian who was standing close behind him. Quickly succeeding the order, the notes of a bugle burst upon the air. Strange sounds in an Indian camp. But the white man's music was not the only sign of civilized life to be observed among the tents of the Utahs. The guns and pistols, the spurs, lances, and saddles, the shakos and helmets, all spoke of the spoiled presidios on the Mexican frontier, while fair-skinned doncellas of Spanish race were seen mingling with the copper-colored squaws, aiding them in their domestic duties. Captives to all appearance contented with their captivity. None of this was new to me. I had witnessed similar scenes in the land of the Comanche. They are of daily occurrence along the whole frontier of Spanish America, where the red man constantly encroaches, reclaiming the country of his ancestors, wrested from him 3 centuries ago by the cupidity of the conquistadors. Upon the side of the Indian now lies the strength, if not in numbers, at least in courage and war prowess. The horse he once dreaded has become his dearest friend, and he can manage him with a skill scarcely equalled by his pale-faced adversary. The lance and fire weapon are in his hands. The spirit thunder no longer appalls him. He knows its origin and nature, and uses it in the accomplishment of a terrible retaliation. On the northern continent, Utah and Yaqui, Kiowa and Comanche, Apache and Navajo have all proved their superiority over the degenerated descendants of Cortez, as in the south have Concho and Cashibo, Guajira and Araucanian, over those of the ruthless Pizarro. The red man no longer goes to war as a mere savage. He has disciplined his strength into a perfect strategy, and possesses a military system as complete as that of most civilized nations. The Comanche cavalry charges in line, and can perform evolutions to the call of the bugle. So can the Utah, as I had evidenced at that moment. Before the trumpet notes had ceased to reverberate from the rocks, 500 warriors had secured their horses, and stood beside them armed and ready to mount. A regiment of regular dragoons could not have responded to boots and saddles with greater expedition. Pegleg took possession of me. "Señor Pintado," said he, speaking in Spanish, and after having examined my wounds, "the best medicine for you will be your breakfast, and while your conpaisana is preparing it, you can come with me, and have a little water thrown over you. This painting does not improve your looks. Besides, if it get into your wounds, they will be all the more difficult to make a cure of. Nos vemos." The Huntress had retired to a tent that stood near that of the chief, and a little to the rear of it. I followed the Mexican, who, in a hobbling gait, proceeded towards the stream. The cold bath, assisted by some house brandy from the gourd zouage of the trapper, soon restored my strength, and the hideous pigment, lathered with the bruised roots of the palmilla, the soap plant of the New Mexicans, soon disappeared from my skin. A few slices of the oregano cactus applied to my wounds placed them in a condition to heal with a rapidity almost miraculous, for such is the curative power of this singular plant. My Mexican medico was yet more generous. and furnished me with a handsome Navajo blanket, which served as a complete covering for my shoulders. "Carambo!" exclaimed he, as he tendered the garment. "Take it, Americano. You may be able to repay me when you have recovered your possible sack from the Arapahoes. Mira," he added, pointing towards the tents, "your breakfast is ready. Yonder the señorita is calling you. Take heed, hombre, or her eyes may cause you a more dangerous wound than any of those you have received from the bullets of the Arapahoes. Vaya." I resisted an inclination to make inquiries, though the hint of the Taos trapper half furnished me with an excuse. My countrywoman, he had called her. No doubt he knew more of her history, but I questioned him not, remembering her promise. I had hopes that I might soon learn it from her own lips. Chapter 73. Chapter 74 of the Wild Huntress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Wild Huntress by Thomas Mayne Reid. Chapter 74. A Beautiful Hostess. "Aha, stranger," said she, as I approached the tent. "He has altered your appearance wonderfully. Oh, you are not so frightful now. Come in. Here is pinole, and a little broiled goat's flesh. I am sorry I did not bring some of the wild sheep. It is most excellent, but in my haste I did not think of it. Bread I cannot give you. We never have it here." "I have been accustomed to ruder fare than this," said I, accepting the proffered viands, and without further ceremony, seating myself to discuss them. There was an interval of silence, during which I continued eating. Once or twice my hostess went out, returning again to see if anything was wanted. The warlike preparations going on outside appeared greatly to interest her, and I thought she regarded them with impatience, or as if anxious about the event. Who or what was the object of this solicitude? Wakaru. In what relationship stood she to the chief? A captive she could scarcely be, else would she not have been permitted to stray so far from the encampment. His wife? The separate tent, as also the style used by the Utah in addressing her, negatived the idea. What then? I longed to hear the history of this wild huntress, but the opportunity had not yet arrived. "Ah," said she, returning once more within the tent, "I fear they will be too late. The red post is only just now erected, and the war dance may last for an hour. It is a useless ceremony, only a superstition. The chief himself does not believe in it, but his braves will not go to battle without performing it. Hark! They are commencing the chaunt." I caught the low monotone of many voices, gradually rising and swelling into a prolonged chorus. At intervals one was heard speaking in solo, as if proclaiming some distinguished deed, to incite the warriors to emulation. Then followed a clangor of yells and loud whoops, breathing menace and revenge. "It is the war song that accompanies their dance," added she. "You may rest till it is finished. Then you must be ready. They will ride off as soon as the ceremony is over." She flung herself on one of the buffalo robes that covered the floor of the tent, and half seated, half reclining, appeared to reflect. The attitude displayed a feminine form of magnificent outlines, and with a face dazzlingly beautiful, this singular woman presented a picture something more than attractive. Wakaru must love her, thought I. As I made this reflection, I again observed the melancholy expression upon her countenance, and once more the resemblance to her of whom I was thinking. My interest in the beautiful huntress was every moment augmenting. I felt an indescribable yearning to hear the story of her misfortunes, for in no other light could I regard the situation in which I had found her. "You have promised to tell me of yourself," said I, reminding her of what she had said. "I shall keep my promise, upon the condition, of which I have forewarned you." "Name it, then. If not impossible, I am ready to accept it." It is not impossible, though it may tax your generosity more than you expect. You have said that you intend returning to the States. Will you take me with you?" A start must have betrayed my astonishment at the unexpected request. "Willingly," I replied, "but now, I fear, it is impossible." "Your journey is not ended? Is that what you mean?" "Alas! I know not when or where it may end." "That is strange. But you intend to go back some time. Till then, let me be your traveling companion?" The proposal left me for the moment without a word to say. "Oh, do not refuse me," continued she, in an appealing tone. "I will wait upon you. I will hunt for you. Anything. But longer I cannot stay here. With all their kindness, and they have been kind in their own rude fashion, I cannot remain. I long for the society of civilized beings. Oh, stranger, I cannot tell you how I long to see." She hesitated. "Whom?" I asked in expectation of hearing a name. "A sister, a sweet gentle sister, who loved me as her own life, whom I loved more than my life. Oh, not till we were parted knew I the strength of that love." "How long since you have seen this sister?" 6 months ago. I left her, deceived by a villain. I left her. 6 years it has seemed. Oh, I cannot endure this savage life. They honor me. They give me all the hospitality in their power. But I am not happy. Stranger, say you will relieve me from this terrible existence. Say you will take me with you. I freely promise it, if it be your desire. But what of these? Will he consent? Who? Wakaru. Yes, yes. He has said I may go, whenever an opportunity should offer. Brave chief! He has nobly kept his word to him who is now no more. To whom? To him who saved my life. To him who saved me. Ah, see, the chief approaches. The war song is ended. At another time I shall tell you all, but not now. We must haste, or the warriors will be gone. Surely you do not intend to accompany us? The women follow at a distance, to take care of the wounded. I go with them." The voice of Wakaru, calling to me to join him and his warriors, put an end to a dialogue that had done but little to illustrate the story of the strange personage by my side. If possible, I was more mystified than ever. But it was not a time to be tempted by the lure of an idle curiosity, however interesting the theme. The perilous situation of my old comrades came once more vividly before my mind. The thought recalled me to my duty, and, hurrying from the presence of that beautiful being, whom I hoped soon to behold again, I leaped upon the back of my horse, and joined the Utah warriors, as they swept in full gallop from out the lines of their encampment. Chapter 74.